Welcome on in, football fans. It's your boy, Gsluke, here with our Monday Night Football preview for tonight's playoff matchup between the Vikings and the Rams. Gonna get you ready for your single game lineups, with first off a look at the Showdown side and what I'm doing over there on Draftkings, and then afterwards we'll break down the prop side of things and what I'm doing over there on Underdog and Prize Picks, and give you a little three-leg slip that I've entered on Underdog you might want to consider adding for a few slips yourself. So by the end, you'll have a good idea of how to attack all of your exposure for this evening. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop on in with first off a look at that Showdown slate. The only real injury news that we're tracking out there before lock is going to be Cam Akers, who is currently questionable but is expected to be playing out there for tonight. So without a whole lot of people that are rolled out or that we're expecting news on out there before lock, it should be a relatively straightforward slate from that perspective. But when we look at the ownership angle, try and do some game scripting, is where it's going to get a little bit more complicated. And the reason I say that is because of the tight spread that we have tonight that is 2.5 points favoring the visiting Vikings. Usually you have these playoff matchups favoring the higher seed, but it's going to be a little bit different this time around. So I think you're going to see a lot of 3-3 builds out there, a lot of teams that are going out there and taking both quarterbacks, stacking 1-2 wide receivers from each team, and not a whole lot of 5-1s or really even 4-2s towards either team. I think if people are going to go with the 4-2, they'll side towards the favorites out there with a Vikings 4-2 script, maybe 2 buybacks over there with LA, but going with a 4-2 Rams stack or really a 5-1 in either direction is going to be a lot lower owned in those GPPs. So if you're entering in some of the big 50 to 100,000 entry contests, you might want to explore going after some of those kind of game scripts. But it's single entry and cash, I kind of get why the 3-3 is so popular. They've got 2 high scoring teams, 2 concentrated offenses with a whole lot of skill position players to boot, and I think you're going to see a relatively high scoring game tonight. So if I was playing in single entries, my cash exposure, for example, are probably going to have both quarterbacks involved. But if I was entering in those large field GPPs, which I haven't quite decided on myself quite yet, if I end up entering in a lot of those GPPs, I'm going to be looking at guys like Kyren Williams at captain and maybe going with a 4-2 Rams lineup. So I think before you go out there and reserve your entries for tonight, kind of have an idea for the sort of lineups that you want to build. And if it's a little bit chalkier out there with a 3-3 or 4-2 Vikings, then maybe go and enter some of the smaller field contests. On the flip side though, if you believe the Rams are going to go out there and get the job done and you're thinking about a 4-2 Rams stack, then you might want to enter those lineups into some of the larger field GPPs. So just a few things to think about before we talk about each player, and we'll start up top out here with Justin Jefferson. So $11,000, maybe a little bit expensive, but in a high scoring game script, a more competitive game, he's got the kind of ceiling to get there at that kind of price. So whether it's a captain or the flex position, captain would be mighty fine and impressive at $16,500. I think Justin Jefferson is going to be playable. And what I've noticed in 2024 is that he's had a lot of bad luck when it comes to touchdowns that have gone to guys like a Jordan Addison and a TJ Hawkinson, especially over the last month or so. He's had a lot of attention out there from the defenses, and if they're watching the tape over the last 3-4 games, they're going to know that they can't completely ignore guys like Addison and Hawkinson when they get down there within the 20-yard line. So I've already bet Justin Jefferson to score. We'll talk about that when we get to props here in a few minutes, but tonight, even at that sort of price tag, he projects for over a 2x points per dollar value. So the ownership's there. You're going to see a lot of ownership at the top end of the board, and as I mentioned before, with the exception of a few players, it's relatively spread out. We don't have one team that is way chalkier than the other. Really, the only quote-unquote low-owned guy up top would be a Cooper Kupp at $9,400, and that's because his projection is by far the lowest. So we'll mention him a little bit later on and what you might want to do with a Cooper Kupp, but the ownership up top is so spread out that you kind of just play your guys up top. You kind of go out there, you correlate your lineup to the best of your ability, and you worry about getting different with leaving salary on the table or by potentially taking some pivots towards the bottom end of the board. Puka Nacua here at $10,600 actually projects even better than a Justin Jefferson. So in terms of my core play towards the top end of the board, it is undoubtedly going to be Puka over a 2.2x points per dollar value, and he's going to be extremely popular at the captain spot. In fact, I've got him by far the highest owned at nearly 25% there, but you could argue that it's well worth it given his 7.5 reception line for tonight is like minus 150 for his over on books. So they just expect a ton of targets out there for Puka, and he's also got well over 50% touchdown equity as well. So even though he's 66% owned, that's only 20% higher owned than Kyren Williams, right? That's only 3% higher owned in terms of the combined ownership compared to Sam Darnold. It's worth it up there at the top end of the board. Kyren Williams is maybe my favorite play out there for GPPs. If I was going to be playing in the large field contest trying to get a little bit different, well, the Rams, when playing from ahead, are one of the most rush-heavy teams in all the NFL. In fact, Kyren Williams averages about 20 rushes per game, which is one of the top numbers, if not the top number in all of the NFL. I haven't checked for a few weeks now, but he's been in that conversation for pretty much the entire year. And at $10,400, he's not cheap. In fact, if you use him at captain, he's a whole $15,600. But I would argue that in those large field GPPs, if you're entering a 4-2 Rams lineup, then he's an absolute no-brainer. He's only about 8.5% ownership over there at captain. You can get a bunch of leverage if you throw him in a quarter of your lineups out there in the GPP, and you can correlate it out there with those 4-2 Rams lineups. As I said, he gets a ton more usage when they're playing from ahead. So if you're playing that 4-2 Rams lineup, building around that offense, not a bad idea to try and use him at the captain spot. The best play on the slate in terms of points per dollar value is a Sam Darnold here. He's only $9,600, which is a huge question mark to me, considering that he projects for nearly 21 fantasy points, which is making him unbelievably chalky. So maybe not as chalky at the captain position. He's only about 9.4% there, but almost a whole 55% owned over there at the flex spot. So Sam Darnold is the jam spot. I think especially if you're playing single entries or cash, you should almost for sure have him out there in your lineups. His floor tonight's probably something close to 14, 15 points, and his median's there around 21 points, but his ceiling is over the 30-point mark if he were to get a super high-scoring game. Cooper Kupp is going to be a huge X factor, a potential X factor. We'll go out there and throw out there. He's not been playing well those last 3-4 games. Puka Nacua has been getting a vast majority of those wide receiver targets, and it's really taken away from his production. So I've only got him at about 24% owned over there at flex. So if you're in those large field GPPs, just like I thought Kyren Williams is a player to keep an eye on, Cooper Kupp would be a good way to get off of that Puka Nacua chalk, whether it's via injury, if Puka were to get hurt somehow, which I hate to even put it out there, but he has been very, very fragile when he's been here in the NFL. If he gets banged up tonight, well, Cooper Kupp would instantly become an absolute smash play. I mean, he'd be on pace for probably like 30 fantasy points if something like that were to happen. And even if Puka plays, what's to say that the Vikings don't go out there and double cover him every single play? So Cooper Kupp is still alive in my opinion. Definitely the kind of guy that I'd be thinking twice about using out there in single entry or cash. But if I'm in those large field GPPs, if I'm trying to get a little bit different to the field, I think there's a lot of utility in taking somebody that's going to be sub 25% owned. You use them in half your lineups, that's that 2x leverage that you're looking for, and it's a real easy way to try and get over the field up top. And really the only way, right? Everyone else up here is at least like 35% owned. The next lowest owned player would be Kyren at about 34%. So even he's a little bit more difficult to get that leverage on. You got Stafford down here at $9,000. I think he's a fantastic play for tonight. Kind of like Sam Darnold is one of those jam spots over there in single entry and cash. You're not worried about the ownership nearly as much in that sort of format. I do think that Sam Darnold is more of a priority for me than a Matthew Stafford, but if I can make it work out there with my game script, I'm trying to take him in a lot of those cash lineups as well. And Aaron Jones Sr. is here at $8,000. He is way too cheap. In fact, I don't understand why Addison, Hawkinson, and Jones are all this cheap on this slate. I know that you've got to make some guys here in the mid-tier range, but Addison has been an absolute stud recently, projects for over 2x points per dollar value, and TJ Hawkinson down here is at 2.2x points per dollar value because he's only $5,600. So the ownership's relatively spread out though, because all of them are super cheap. If guys like Aaron Jones were $9,000, if we had like a $8,500 Addison, like he probably should be, and then Hawkinson was $5,600, he'd be like 80% owned, right? Same thing. If Hawkinson was where he should be, and then Addison was the one super low priced, he'd probably be like 60 to 70% owned. But because all of these guys are super cheap and the ownership has to spread out, I've only got them at about 40% combined ownership. So in my opinion, all of them are really good plays for tonight. And up top, there's not that many guys I want to avoid. If I'm playing in GPPs, I'm still playing guys like a Cooper Kupp, a Kyren Williams. I guess in single entries, those are the kind of guys that I'm going out there and exiting off. But up here towards the top end of the board, in my opinion, there's nobody that's just a clear X off spot. So it's a spot to really just go out there, correlate towards the top end of the board. I'm not really sure if I'm excluding anyone from my player pool, and more so trying to make those ownership stands and trying to get different towards the bottom end of the board. But speaking of, I've got some hot takes down here towards the bottom. So these kickers, I don't have that much interest in tonight. I'll probably have a little bit of Will Reichard, but they're not my favorite plays. They usually aren't my favorite plays to begin with. Demarcus Robinson is perhaps the first hot take, and with Cooper Kupp being a little bit disappointing lately, Demarcus Robinson has seen an increase in snap share. Now that we're in the playoffs, that could end up changing. They could be ramping up Cooper Kupp, could have been resting him the last few weeks. I think that is a possibility, but if you're looking to get really different, I'm talking sub 15% ownership, Demarcus Robinson could be a flyer to keep an eye on. Another one, a deep downfield wide receiver, would be Jalen Nailor. Unfortunately, is behind a whole bunch of other targets over there from Minnesota, but is only $3,600. And kind of like Robinson, both of these players here, usually when they're getting usage, it's 15 to 20 yards downfield. They're not going in there to get you those 5 to 6 yard slants. So if they're going to contribute, give us a few catches, it could be like 3 catches for 50, 60 yards. And if there's a touchdown involved with any of those sort of plays, it could be an optimal performance for these sort of wide receivers. A Tutu Atwell is a little bit further down the depth chart. He is another big play wide receiver though, so I do prefer Demarcus just because of the snap share recently, but Tutu Atwell, maybe in the largest of GPPs, could be used as a flyer at sub 10%. Tyler Higbee is by far the best value play down low, and unfortunately, he's going to be getting all of the ownership. So I've got him at about 25% combined ownership down low, and the idea is that Higbee is the number one tight end now that he's had a few weeks to return from injury, and though he's not projecting through the roof, I've only got him at about 6.6 points. That's over a 2x points per dollar value, and we have nobody else that is 5K and below that is going to be at a 2x points per dollar value. So a ton of the optimizers, anyone that's really running anything with any sort of computer assistance is going to be getting a ton of Tyler Higbee in their lineups, which for single entry cash, I think makes sense. He is by far the best projecting play down low, but in single, outside of those single entries out there in like GPP contests, the Nailors, even in Atwell, going to some of these more, high upside GPP sort of plays is I think how you should be handling it. Down towards the bottom, Parkinson, he's going to be playing a few snaps. And then I'd actually prefer, if you're looking for a backup tight end tonight, Josh Oliver over there from Minnesota, because they run quite a few 2 tight end sets. And Oliver has been very productive this year, particularly before you had Hawkinson returning. He was posting a really solid fantasy output week to week out there. And he's not going to play as much. He has definitely seen a downtick in his snap share, but in those 2 tight end sets, which are used predominantly in the red zone, he does have a chance to go out there and score. So Josh Oliver definitely will be in my GPP player pool if I'm entering those sort of contests, even a Tutu Atwell. But if you're looking to be a little bit safer down towards the bottom, it's probably a Tyler Higbee. I hate to say that there's like no other choices down here, but if you're looking for safety, he's really the only guy that you can get to. So maybe you use a defense if you're correlating in a 4-2 either way. Didn't mean to completely ignore those before, but if you're running a 4-2 Rams lineup, going out there using Kyren Williams at captain, you might want to consider throwing a Rams defense into that lineup as well. And now for the prop side of things, where I've got a 3-leg slip that I've already entered that you might want to keep an eye on yourself. So it pays about 5x over here on Underdog. I got it for just over 5.5x. This multiplier on Puka was not there when I ended up taking it, but still 3 props that I really like for tonight that also correlate that you might want to see in a higher scoring game script. So first off, we got this over on Matthew Stafford passing touchdowns. He was minus 120 for a lot of the overs on major books, but Pinnacle, right before I entered it, moved him to minus 126 for the over. So a little bit of steam moving in that direction, and considering that they're underdogs for tonight, I think a lot of their output is likely to come through the air, particularly if they're playing from behind in the second half. You've seen that from these playoff teams. They will try and, scratch and claw all they can to try and get back into these games, and a lot of times it comes with the passing output towards the end of the game. So I do think the Vikings end up winning tonight. That's at least where I'm leaning towards my outright bet tonight, which is why I'd be looking on this kind of over. And that's kind of the idea with this slip, is that the Vikings likely going to go out there and build a lead, and you're going to have to see them passing from behind over there in LA. Next up, we got this Justin Jefferson over on touchdowns. This isn't really a plus EV lean or anything like that, but more so just leaning into the correlation that we're looking for here. Jefferson is, if you heard me going through him in the fantasy section, has had a lot of bad luck lately when it's come to the touchdown upside. A lot of looks going to guys like Addison and Hawkinson instead of him, likely because of the scheme on the defensive side. He's been taken out by double teams over there in the red zone, and I think once you've gotten into the playoffs, you've seen guys like Addison roast teams. I mean, he's had like 2-3 touchdown games. You've had guys like Hawkinson have a really strong end to the year. I think that it's only going to open up more usage for Justin Jefferson. So he's about even money on the two-way markets like Pinnacle to score. So it's not like it's a bad bet to go over there and take this over. He's about even money, so it's a pretty fair payout. But on sites like the major books like Draftkings, FanDuel, etc., he's closer to -120 to -130 for the over. So you want to take those with a grain of salt. They're not two-way markets like you have there in Pinnacle. Those are the much more accurate odds because you can actually bet on the no on those sort of markets. But considering the correlation that we're looking for here, this is the exact kind of prop that we want from the Vikings. A scoring prop, something that's going to likely make the Rams have to go out there and pass a little bit more, which is where you're getting the correlation between these two teams. And then the last prop I took was this over on Puka Nacua receptions. Now, I took this without a multiplier. They just ended up adding this before I went to record this video. So if you want to take it out, I would perfectly understand that. Heck, you could even change it to an over on receiving yards if you want to get closer to that 5.5x payout. But even if you took it out and ran with those top two, I think that's a purely a decent play. But what I took here at the 7.5 receptions line is he's -150 for his over on books. So obviously the Patreon members were able to get that value before it ended up moving. But at -150 odds and then even money on a site here like Underdog, that is some of the best value that you can possibly get. Now, if you wanted to enter these over on Prize Picks, they didn't have the Matthew Stafford prop posted, so that's why we couldn't enter it over there on that side. But Puka was up over there at 8 receptions, so you could take him without a multiplier, but 0.5 higher. And Jefferson was also even money to go out there and score. So if they repost the Matthew Stafford prop, maybe you go over and enter it on Prize Picks. But the unfortunate part is it's still only going to give you a 5x payout, right? Only about 0.1x more than what you're getting over here in Underdog, and you're not having to take him up at 8 receptions over there with Puka Nacua. So I would still probably say to go over and enter it on Underdog. Even with this multiplier, it's about the same payout you'd get for a 3-man over there on the Prize Pick side. It's not the best structured slip when it comes to the payout structure. At 5.5x though, it was a good payout slip, and that's why I took it for my Patreon members. So of course, guys, for all the different slips I'm taking for these games, make sure to check out my Patreon page, link in the description of the video to go out there and join that, as well as to go out there and join the DFS tier to get all the projections that you see on there. All the player pool notes, script notes, player notes that I have on that sheet are completely uncensored over there for my Patreon members, and it's only $15 a month to go over there and join. So we'll be covering all of this throughout the rest of the playoffs. Make sure to go ahead and join if you haven't already, but that's all I've got out there for this week. Alrighty guys, best of luck with all of your exposure for Monday Night Football. The divisional round was a whole lot of fun to watch. Maybe not so great during that Steelers-Ravens game, but hey, I kind of expected us to get our asses whooped. But the rest of the playoffs are going to be an absolute blast to watch. Make sure you subscribe to the Patreon so you don't miss any of that content. And for videos, we'll be trying to do them when we can. I've got golf season going on. It is a lot of work over there on the golf side, so I try and get this football stuff in when I can. The Patreon is obviously what I prioritize. It's what I go out there and post all the content for 24/7. But on the YouTube side, I'm going to try and make sure I get these videos to you guys as soon as I can, and whenever I can, of course, depending on my availability. So best of luck out there with all of your exposure for tonight. Go out there, crush it. I want to see some of your names towards the top end of those GPPs. Subscribe to the channel if you guys haven't already as well, and make sure to check out all the golf content on my channel if that's something that you guys are watching as well. We've got the Amex this week, should be an absolute blast. It's a 3-course event and usually a very low scoring event, so I'm looking forward to that. Should be a lot of fun over there on the golf side, and best of luck over there with your NFL exposure for Monday.